Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome. A very warm welcome to all of you to this lecture about the public value of our university and the role of our knowledge institutions. Thank you all for coming and for joining us. My name is Jaap Jansen and I'm program maker of Studium Generale. And I would like to start with by mentioning which parties made this lecture possible. 3. It's Studium Generale. We organize lectures, debates, lecture series, not only for the students, but also for the people of Maastricht. It's Studio Europa, Maastricht, and that's a meeting place for scientists, for politicians, but also for citizens, for people of Maastricht, for students, where they talk about Europe and the future of Europe and try to give shape to Europe by doing this. And thirdly, that's the Maastricht platform for community engaged research. And I have a very short video clip for you that explains who they are, but I will show it after the introduction, the very short introduction, and this will only take 2 minutes. So I would like to thank all these parties for making this lecture possible. But first and foremost, of course, I would like to thank the guest speaker for coming to Maastricht. Thank you, thanks a lot.
Thank you for having me.
And that's Professor Alan Irwin. And it's a great honor and a great privilege to have you here, so thank you. And he is a professor in the Department of Organization at the Copenhagen Business School. And he was till 2014, from 2007 till 2014, the Dean of Research also at the Copenhagen Business School. And previously he held positions at the University of Liverpool, the University of Manchester and Brunel University, to mention a few. And Professor Irwin has published on issues of scientific governance, science public relations, and science and technology policy, amongst others. And tonight, Professor Irwin will go into questions like, how do citizens and knowledge institutions relate to one another? What possibilities are there for citizens to engage within these processes of innovation and change that take place in these universities and these knowledge institutions? And what does it mean to put public value at the core of our European universities, especially European universities? And I will show the clip. It's a very short clip. And then and after the clip, I would like to have a warm applause for Mr. Alan Irwin. 1 moment.
Community-engaged research means having conversations with people.
Science, communication, and society.
Community-engaged research means that we as a university take our societal task very seriously by having researchers interact directly with the community outside to find solutions that are of immediate benefit for society.
Community-engaged research means knowledge that benefits the public.
Collective intelligence.
Community-engaged research means involvement with society.
Impact on people's lives. Community-engaged research means collaboration.
For me, it means creating an impact with society.
Co-creation.
It is about the partnership with the stakeholders.
Indoor air pollution due to cooking is a major problem in India. We collaborate with the local community to develop and disseminate improved cook stoves. In our project, it is essential to work together in order to reach higher levels of acceptance and to obtain sustainable results.
Crowd stimulates the interaction between researchers and society, and it also facilitates the understanding of a complex academic world at Maastricht University.
In May, Queen of Hearts
gave us the connection between companies and research at Maastricht University.
Community engaged research is important because we are creating value by engaging the people in Elslo in asking questions that are addressing their needs.
It is about taking the knowledge, wisdom and experiences of people living in disadvantaged communities very seriously, because this is the only basis for successfully co-designing healthy and caring cities.
Our goal is to bring together everyone at Maastricht University who is passionate about research that could change society. So, are you also eager to have social impact?
Join us!
Wasn't that a nice clip? We will have 45 minutes for the lectures, more or less, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less. We will see how it goes. And after the lecture, you can ask as many questions as you like. You can give comments or reflect on what you've heard, whatever. I would like to give the floor now to Professor Alan Irwin. The floor is yours. Please give him a warm applause.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. It was a lot of fun watching that and watching the reaction of people in the audience who often looked a little embarrassed at times, but I thought you looked great. And I want to say thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for being here. I don't know if this is the warm-up to Carnival or because you're here because you're trying to avoid Carnival or whatever you're doing, but I'm very grateful to be here, and I'm very grateful to the person up there. So you can't see the person up there, but I can. And I'm hoping you're going to ask a question. There's an old clip of the Beatles, that's how old I am, where they're playing somewhere in London, and they make a joke about the fact that there's 3 levels in the audience: the cheap seats, the middle seats, and the really expensive seats. And they say, well, the people in the cheap seats stamp your feet, and the people in the middle seats clap your hands, and the people in the top seats just rattle your jewelry. So if you can rattle your jewelry, that will also be fine. And I don't know how long this is going to take, but I don't want to drive you away. So you can just ask questions at any point while I'm speaking. Please don't wait till the end. And I'll probably, you can see I like to move around already. I'm not allowed to cross that line for reasons I can't remember. But I will move closer if you don't ask me, bless you, if you don't ask me any questions. So I've got this title, Science, Citizenship and the Public Value of the University, but I'm very aware that right here in Maastricht there's a lot of discussion going on about the social university. Perhaps we can talk about that as we're going along. So I'm here to reflect on my own experience, but I'm also here hopefully to encourage some discussion, particularly about this idea of public value. And as you were kind enough to say, you'll hear me basically drawing on 2 things. This is all I've got to offer. My background as someone in science and technology studies, in Maastricht is a fabulous place for science and technology studies with a major international reputation. And then I've done a funny thing in my life. I've also been a dean in 3 different universities. That is completely insane for someone who never really wanted to do anything more than to teach. But I was a dean at Brunel University and at Liverpool University, and then in Copenhagen. I moved to Copenhagen 13 years ago. And I don't say that to impress you. You can be impressed or not impressed, but you'll probably hear a mix of my kind of practical experience, but also my interests as an STS scholar. I can't tell those 2 things apart, but it might explain something of what I want to say. Just playing with the microphone here. So where do we start? Is it echoing?
No, it's fine.
Is it better now? Oh, it is actually, yeah, thank you. So a book I like very much is by Cohen and March, interestingly entitled Leadership and Ambiguity, and I'm dying to play with the fancy focus thing here. Oh, look at that. That's just, And it's about US college presidents. So the leadership and ambiguity title for me is rather well chosen. And it says almost any educated person can deliver a lecture entitled The Goals of the University. So that's just to remind me why I'm here. I'm trying to impress you with being an educated person. But it goes on, almost no one will listen to the lecture voluntarily. So it doesn't really explain why you're here, even if it explains why I'm here. Because it's true, it's one of those topics. I mean, everyone in the room, I would guess, has got experience of university life from different perspectives. And you can all talk about the goals of the university. I hope you will do that as we go on. I'm going to do three things here. That's basically what I'm going to do. I want to talk about challenges and opportunities, and I'll be interested to hear whether your ideas of the challenges and opportunities match with my idea of doing that. I will go on to frame some questions, and again, we can take those backwards and forwards. And then I want to talk about seeking new paths and new ways forward. As you can gather already, I have some views about the way in which discussion about the nature of the university often gets just jammed in some kind of rather defensive discussion. So I'd like to use this occasion to perhaps have some shared inspiration about ways we might do something different. None of that is a critique of any university in particular. It's just I have a strong feeling when I look particularly internationally that that's necessary. So challenges and opportunities, let's start there. And I put thanks to Ron Barnett there. Ron Barnett is an emeritus professor in London, and I listened to him give a lecture on a related subject a few weeks ago. So I'm saying this because if I've taken ideas from Ron, which I might well have done, I want to acknowledge that. Ron talks about the number of students. I have no way of verifying these figures, but it's a very interesting phenomenon to say there could be that many universities. He puts that in quotation marks because he means higher education institutions, so we have to be careful. There are many places in the business of higher education and which are not necessarily called universities. It's a huge state and personal investment. It's a huge investment from governments. It's a huge personal investment being at university. For many countries, the UK would be an obvious example where I spend quite a bit of time. It's actually a major export industry. I've seen figures suggesting over 1% of the GDP in the UK is related to university education. You see those numbers bouncing around. It's not a small thing when you think of the number of students who are traveling internationally. China, for example, comes to mind right now, made more vivid by the COVID-19 situation. It's a major industry also in Australia, in many countries around the world. Business schools, there's Mr. Business School, Professor Business School sitting right there, Peter Mulgo, major growth area. I mean, huge development of business education across the world. And what we also hear very commonly, recurrently, is the idea, certainly we hear this in Denmark, about the routes to economic competitiveness in modern Europe is through research and higher education. In Denmark, where I live and work now, it would be, well, we don't have any natural resources. Our labor costs are very high. So if we're going to compete in the world, it's going to be through research and higher education. And we're going to have the idea too, very strong, about innovation. As many colleagues in science and technology studies, SDS, point out, innovation has become a kind of panacea, a mantra. It's the way to the future. And how will we, in this part of Europe, achieve innovation? It will be by higher education, it will be by research. So that sounds like a very positive situation. I mean, you probably have views already about whether you like that kind of representation or not, but it sounds like in many ways you could say the university system is a huge success story. And then we've got what I've called here the university ecosystem. That you've got the classic universities, you've got specialized universities. Copenhagen Business School is like that. It's a business university. We're not part of another institution. We have 21,000 students, or the Danish Technical University. You have, well, I'm loosely calling them entrepreneurial universities. Arizona State's ASU is quite an interesting example, and I noticed when your president, the University of Maastricht president, was talking, he made reference to ASU particularly. It's quite an interesting example at Arizona State of an institution taking a different path. You know, why can't large-scale participation, getting non-traditional communities involved in the university, and research excellence go together? So a rather radical attempt to say, well, we can do the business of doing a university differently. Roskilde University in Denmark has a reputation of being one actually founded on rather Marxist principles. Those are not so strong now, but the idea of a place where social impact is taken seriously is still very strong now. So you have alliances of universities internationally which are trying to do something different. My hometown is Sunderland, so of course I mentioned Sunderland University, but there's a model very different from Arizona State and certainly very different from Oxford of a teaching-based institution. Sunderland University, which I will come back to later, is there basically in a rather economically deprived area. It's the area I grew up in, which depended on shipbuilding and coal mining, and now where the shipyards used to be on the banks of the River Wear, there is a university which is trying to cater for the needs of people growing up in that area who will not go to Oxford or somewhere like that. They will have vocational training of different kinds. We hear about massive open online courses, city, campus, satellite, and regional universities. But still it seems to me, and this is the point I want to make, that when we think of the university, we think of, oh, I'm going to try it with this Zoomer thing. Oh yeah, we think of, it's a bit slow, those, and I'm not very good at it, those at the top. You know, as the president of Arizona State University has said, you know, why is it, you know, that every developing country in the world wants to be like Oxford or Cambridge? Why would it be that just one model of what a university is about has such a powerful influence? Why is China, for example, competing exactly in that world of research-led elite institutions? And here talk about rankings, etc., comes to mind. So I think one of the feelings I have, which I want to get right out there, is despite this ecosystem, despite the alternative models, it seems that when we think of a university, only one model comes to mind, the kind of thing that's at the top. And please notice, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that model. I'm simply saying that we have to ask ourselves the question, is that the best model to work in a diversity of needs? Is it the only model of what a university could be? Or would we want, as I'm leading you along, to reflect a little bit about the differences? And then, so to say, is, I've already mentioned Ronald Barnett, but he would also say, there are the worries and the problems in the university system. And there's a lot of that discussion right now. In fact, if you talk to many people around the university system, this is very often what you hear, some of the problems of the current system. Tighter audit regimes, many countries, the UK is kind of extreme, I suppose, in many ways, talk about the audit culture and the way in which for teachers or for students, it seems like we're just constantly being measured and evaluated, with the argument being, of course, that that gets in the way of learning. Or metricization, the way in which metrics are moving into just about every area. As I teach, I'm evaluated, a number is produced about the student's satisfaction in my teaching style. You can guess how bad that's going to be for me. And that then is a number, a metric, which no one ever says to me, oh, you know, that's good or bad, or occasionally I will get some feedback, but we all know that we're being measured when we're teaching. And of course the same goes for students, and the same goes for citation counts and journal rankings, etc., etc. A lot of discussion now, which is very interesting, about issues of well-being among students and among staff. Certainly in Denmark there's a big movement current minister is very strong on this, to deal with issues of student well-being. A lot of concern, rightly so, about stress among university students, about what's driving that, how is it that this is developed, and what should universities and other parties be doing to remedy that. That's quite a big issue, I would say, right now, student stress and anxiety. But of course it's there among university staff as well. The British Higher Education magazine, which many of you will have heard of, the Higher or the Times Higher Education Supplement, does I guess it must be a daily email. And this morning, the email I was just looking at, it said, why are academics working such long hours? And there's two stories that the Higher highlights just today. One is a story, I don't even know if it's true, of someone making a grant application during his children's birthday party. He couldn't take time out from a birthday party to write a grant application. And the other one was actually someone I admire very much, a person called Mary Beard, who's a classical scholar, but talks about many other issues. And she's writing about how she works 100 hours a week. 100 hours a week. And that leads to a discussion, and I'm not presenting this as a sort of straightforward thing. Mary Beard presumably likes what she does. It comes across, she's on television a lot, but come on, is this long hours culture something that's healthy? Problematic conditions of academic leadership. What do I mean by that? I guess I have this idea, and I'm just putting it very personally now, that there's possibly something wrong with the idea that taking on a position like a head of department position is just like getting some sort of sentence from the court. People will make jokes a lot. Should you be congratulated or should you be commiserated on becoming a head of department? How long are you head for? 5 years. Wow. You get less time than that for murder these days. So there's something about which is healthy on the one hand, I have to say, that we're right to be skeptical of leaders and to want to ask questions about them. But how do we have a university system which is encouraging change, or do we have one which tends to be deeply conservative? It means there's a lot of political critique of universities is disconnected, and a lot of defensive reactions, I would say, from all sides. So on the one hand, you've got this tremendous growth of university, a major success story, you could say, in many countries, and at the same time, you have some of those issues. In Denmark, when we wrote about this, we talked, this is my good colleague, Maya Horst, to whom I'm also married, that we said, well, sometimes the debate in Denmark is between the freedom fighters and the social engineers. This was us being a little provocative. I thought these social engineers would get most annoyed. Actually, it was the freedom fighters who really got irritated. What did we mean? Well, we meant that in our country, the tendency is when people are debating or discussing the future of the university, you either get, well, I'm sure you can work it out for yourself, the people who say, well, look, the key thing is what's the employability rate of people going into different courses. That's the key thing. And what's the throughput? So we need to measure that, and we need to be more precise about it. Producing a discussion about, for example, well, what's the value of philosophy? Therefore, if people don't go on to have successful jobs afterwards, why are we teaching so many philosophy students? That's something which keeps coming up. So the social engineering side is about measurement. Nothing wrong with measurement, by the way, but seems to imply that that's all that matters when you're coming to university education. The freedom fighters, okay, what do we mean by that? That's the move to say, leave us alone. We in the university know best. Let's keep our strong academic values, and any attempt to open up a discussion about, for example, accountability to wider society, or let's be horrible and say it, the value for money related to universities, should be avoided. We just don't want that discussion at all. So it seems to us, just to put it right up there, that both those positions, of course, have got some sense to it. I'm not naturally a social engineer, but I can see why someone has to ask, questions about, well, what's the value of university? It's not, the question itself from where I'm standing is not wrong, but the fact that it's only measured in that way is deeply problematic. The same as I have a lot of sympathy, I guess a lot of my friends would count themselves as freedom fighters. It's quite right, of course, to defend academic freedom and particularly to defend it against those who might simply make the university a consultancy company. But of course, taken to an extreme as the only position that you adopt, again, it doesn't leave a space for talking about, well, what then is the ethical responsibility? What then is the public responsibility of the university? So you can see that for yourself, that we're basically arguing something about the nature of diversity. Britain is an extreme case in many ways, I do think. It's probably the country where the idea of the entrepreneurial university and the idea of the university is basically a business has been taken more than I've seen anywhere else, certainly compared to working in Northern Europe. But of course, as many of you will have heard, this causes issues too. And the hometown of Sunderland is famous for its football team, and the football team has many famous supporters. That is a Sunderland shirt. So that might help us. But what really interested me is how on the one hand, you've got a place, Sunderland became famous because it was the first town that came out in favor of Brexit. 61% of this working class, Labour supporting community came out in favor of Brexit. And then just by the river where the shipyards used to be, you have the University of Sunderland as the place that I mentioned before. So you have a context of university being developed in the non-traditional university area and trying to do something to create jobs and employment. But this caught my eye particularly in The Guardian, the newspaper I'm sure most of you know, where the University of Sunderland, well, you can see it for yourself in the subhead there. I'm so bad at this. There it is. Sunderland University is offering only career-focused courses to its next cohort. And Kenan Malik, the journalist, says, no history, no languages. The end of humanities only deepens divides. And down there below, it says, all this explains why Sunderland University's decision is so depressing. It's a university, like many in the Northeast, that caters to students from the local area. Its repurposing seems to suggest that the study of the humanities should be reserved for the children of the rich who could afford to move, while local working class students should be confined to vocational subjects. Existing divisions will only deepen. And yeah, I really would like to have a discussion with you about that, because I must confess, when I look at something like that, I find myself, I guess, on both sides of the discussion. I'm someone who grew up in the humanities, so I would think of myself very much as a humanities scholar, and that's my hometown. So it feels, as the journalist reports, that that's a deeply regressive step, that humanities education would not be available to, as it says there, working class students. I guess that was me back when I was younger. But at the same time, of course, you can see the context in which the university works, of trying to do something particular and specific in terms of its role, which leads it to emphasize vocational courses, thus hopefully creating jobs and regenerating the area economically. So you can understand why the rector or the vice chancellor of that university might have found that extremely difficult to keep humanities courses alive and well in a situation where the emphasis of the university was going somewhere different. So it's fine to defend the humanities, and one should defend the humanities, but one can also see the operating conditions on which universities work. And then at the same time, and I'm going to pause in just a moment, we have much wider discussions in society about what I'm calling here scientific citizenship, about, well, what do we do in a democracy when we want people to participate, this is an old quotation, from a science and technology studies scholar, Dorothy Nelkin, where she says, well, the complexity of public decisions seems to require highly specialized and esoteric knowledge, and those who control this knowledge have considerable power. Yet democratic ideology suggests that people must be able to influence policy decisions that affect their lives. When you think of that, when you think of issues of scientific citizenship, then you have to ask yourself, where does the university come into that? Is that something which the university should be in the lead of? Is the job of the universities to encourage this kind of democratic scrutiny of science, technology, and knowledge? Or is that something which, so to say, the university should step back from, because we are the traditional bastions of higher education and research, and we should certainly not be engaging in such citizen issues? So I mentioned the concept right here of cognitive justice. I'm getting a little better at this. You're bringing knowledge and citizenship together. Is that the business of the university to be involved in such a concept as knowledge justice? Or is it our job to say, no, we are sort of a timeless institution. It's inappropriate for us to get involved in so many ways. And I just use this PowerPoint to say that this pressure or this discussion about the relationship between science and citizenship comes up in many different ways, in individualized medicine, in self-drive cars, climate change. On the left, that is, it doesn't seem to point where I'm looking, that's the Danish strategy for artificial intelligence, so in an area like that. And then I wanted to mention this one over here, also from Denmark. This is the role of the Climate Council and its recent report on biomass and the green possibilities of biomass. So in lots of different ways you can see this discussion taking place across society, but you have to ask yourself, well, you know, where then does the university fit into this? Just to go back to my previous point, I think thinking of social engineering on the one hand and freedom fighting on the other, if you forgive that provocative terminology, doesn't seem in any way to be saying, well, where then should we be, speaking on behalf of the universities, in that kind of change? So what I wanted to say there was, it seems that there are challenges. You can recognize these challenges both inside the system from students and staff who are struggling in many ways. There's a lot more to say about that. But there's also opportunities, citizen science, I think I'll come back to later on, where you can see new developments. I'm not saying it's the only thing that's happening in society, but it may be that the voice of the university is not sufficiently strong when it comes to these things, which of course is why I'm so pleased about the citizen engagement type activities taking place at this university. So it may be that it's already happening here. But now I'm just going to take a little pause because I've spoken for, I don't know, 25 minutes or longer. And I wanted to say to you, do you recognize this agenda? Because I'm not here at Maastricht and I'm not based in the Netherlands. Are there things I'm missing? Or would you say you disagree? It's perfectly okay to say that you want to defend freedom fighting or even social engineering in this situation. So now I'm looking for some reactions to give me a sense of where we are in the discussion. Please, sir.
Wait for the microphone.
And I don't know if we need a microphone, but for the recording.
Well, what I missed till now is what you can say. So universities get more political these days. Mm-hmm. So it's about political correctness, and all the students get, in fact, kind of courses in how to be political correct. And well, that to me is not a very good development, and I don't hear anything about that. So at first I saw a really positive kind of video, yes. But to me, it was not that positive. It was all about how to get grip on society, how to make a kind of ideological stance on political correctness and push it on the society. So to me, it's not a very positive thing.
Okay. So your concern, I'm just trying to get this thing about political correctness, is that you think the universities are too close-minded, that they're not exploring new ideas, but they're trying to enforce a particular sense of what's valuable and what isn't in society?
Well, I think they don't research enough opinions. So they have a pre-selection of opinions which they like and which they don't like, and the one they don't like, they don't get the funds, they don't get the credits. So these thoughts are really dying.
Yeah, okay.
In my opinion.
Yeah, okay.
And only political correct kind of thoughts are always nourished and always give money to it. They always get chances.
Okay, thank you. Any more comments or reactions to, please?
If I may.
You may, but you can't until you get the...
You have to wait.
You may and you may not. Yes, please.
Sorry for the recording. The theme of the year for what we're working on is this concept of academic leadership that you mentioned.
And we being?
The university. I think that was, I'm looking at the dean here, but the question that we have is, the discussions that we're having is, we don't know what that is. Academic leaders. So it's not just department heads or people who have published as many as possible to become deans or university presidents. The question is, what makes a good academic leader? So I guess my question is, in your view, what is an academic leader? And is it where, compared to what you've seen, are these ideal academic leaders that are in practice now? And is that different from the ideal that you have in your head? Sorry.
But it's a brilliant question, because that's what I'm going to come to when I talk about seeking new paths. But I think I'm really pleased that you talk about what leadership is. So just to give you a clue to what I've got in mind, it isn't just about individuals being the leader. It's about how the university demonstrates leadership. Just to give you a clue to the kind of thing that I'm thinking about, that if we just put that onto one person and then we all relax, then we're missing something rather important. Okay, I'll take a third comment. Do you want to rattle your jewelry up there? No? No, she's okay. Another comment just to help me out a little bit, please. Yes.
Okay, this is the third one, completely unrelated to the other two. But then it comes back to what you were saying about the social engineers. And it's interesting to me that when they talk about the removal of the humanities, for example, in Sunderland, it's framed as being a social engineering move. But I'm Canadian.
Yeah, I can hear
that.
About.
And, and our tuition fees are very high. So where I grew up, for a lot of students, they did, for example, nursing as a university level education in Canada. And a lot of them found that attractive because they knew when they came out they'd be making $60,000 to $80,000 a year. And they didn't come from families that had a lot of money, and tuition rates are high. So if they weren't doing something where they could come right out into the job market, they would be in financial ruin. Our student loan interest rates are over 5%. So to me, it's not even social engineering necessarily. It's also in the case of the students, when tuition rates are that high, what is a smart move to make financially. So it's also a bit annoying to see it framed that way, because it's some people just don't have the financial means to go and do. Philosophy degrees are great, and they do have lots of applications in society. But if you can't get a job afterwards, and now you have $50,000 of student debt, that's very difficult for a lot of people. So.
Yes, no, but that's a great point. Thank you. It's people are making choices, but not under conditions of their own choosing. In the UK, that is extreme. I mean, there are tuition fees also in the UK, which vary a little bit, but not an enormous amount. So it's actually a big investment. And then you're back to the same issue of personally, or even for your family, you're in some kind of economic investment sort of way of thinking, which would lead someone away. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to Oxford to study philosophy, that's got some buying power, certainly, but Sunderland to study philosophy, so there's some kind of, and that's to say nothing against, people teaching philosophy in that situation. They could be better than the people at Oxford. They could provide a better education, for all I know. But of course it puts a particular context. So these are real choices that people are facing. And I'm totally 100% with defending the humanities, but of course part of defending the humanities has got to be to deal with that kind of question. It's no good to say that this, to me, that's instrumental logic and it's, totally inappropriate. It's also necessary to say, well, what then can we say to someone in that situation? How do we defend the humanities in a way which isn't just leave us alone? I do see a lot of defense of the university, which I admire, but seem to me to miss some of these basic points about the choices that people are making. All right, I'm going to move on. That was challenges and opportunities. I'm going to move on to framing the questions. There's a quote I like very much from a philosopher, actually, Alfred North Whitehead. The task of a university is the creation of the future so far as rational thought and civilized modes of appreciation can affect the issue. The future is big with every possibility of achievement and of tragedy. The idea of the university is the creation of the future, but of course it's not just the university that creates the future. But what I like about that is it puts the position of the university in a much more ambitious setting than simply talking about individual courses and whether it's right or wrong at a particular university. And that's what led me to the public value aspect that's in the title of this lecture. There's a book by John Brewer called The Public Value of the Social Sciences, which I think at least tries to raise some of these, let me guess, or let me say, deeper questions about what the purpose of a university education is. And you're immediately thinking, yeah, but what then is the public value of the university? What is it that he's talking about when he uses that term? I think John Brewer's point is to say that, that's what the university has to work out. And different universities could have different senses of what public value is. So it's for me also a way of opening up the category and saying there are different models that could be used. In that sense, public value for Sunderland University, to stick with that example, could be very different from public value at Maastricht or at Copenhagen Business School. It's a way of saying, well, what then is the role? What is it that we're actually trying to achieve? So it's really a very profound kind of question. And I'm sure John Brewer gets this from, there's an American writer called Mark Moore. I'm sure it comes from Mark Moore's idea of public value. He basically compares that to private sector value and says it's much harder, this is Mark Moore, in the public sector to define value. But that doesn't mean there is no value. It's just that simply reducing it to economic value will be to miss the point. So the discussion about what then is the public value of the university, for me, is a way of trying to get out of what I characterized earlier as a defensive discussion and to say instead, well, there are different models. The public value of Arizona State University is to be a mass participation university. I think it might have 100,000 students or something of that order, but also to be a place where there's research excellence. That's our value. We want to do both those things. That's a big stretch, but it does have consequences for the way in which the university is organized. Public value in my institution, Copenhagen Business School, often is described as business in society. There's some idea that there is a way of thinking about the social aspect of business which makes us distinctive. I guess that's the kind of thinking I want to encourage, to say, well, what then is the value of a university education? Not simply in economic terms, but with some larger reflection on it. So what I like about it is it's a way of enabling conversations. inside but also just as importantly outside the university about what it is the university is trying to achieve. It's not a divisive rhetoric. The idea is to say, well, groups who are not listened to, which I think is what you were talking about before, when you're talking about political correctness, also have a right to be involved in this discussion. Impact is okay, but that's a very particular model, I have to say, of the relationship between the university and wider society. And it has that immediate sense of the university being something outside of society, which then, so to say, impacts upon it. Ideas of co-creation or ideas of shared value are very different. So I'm looking for a discussion which opens up rather than closes down, and which questions the purposes of the university. So the kind of things that interest me and that I'd like to talk about are, how do we open up a more forward-looking discussion about the role of the universities? How actually do we avoid just falling into this fixed model of every university should be like Oxford or Cambridge, or ideas that it's either research excellence or it's mass participation. There must be some other variables, and there's a lot of clever people working in the university sector who ought to be able to deal with that. How actually do we encourage experimentation and diversity in the university system? See, I like the idea of having different paths and different universities rather than all of them just following one natural model. Again, as I said before, this isn't about criticizing successful places which are world-leading research institutions, nothing against that, but that can't be the only imagination that we have. And one concern I have there, I think, is that it's actually very difficult to experiment in a university setting. It's quite interesting how conservative the institution can be in a situation where you have lots of really clever, very creative people in all kinds of ways. But the institutional discussion, I'm putting it provocatively, doesn't move on. And how do you maintain the traditional values of the university while embracing some of those larger ideas of citizenship and public value that I was talking about before? So basically, as you can hear, I think very clearly, I'm saying that, it won't deal with all the problems of the university, but having a more fundamental rethink about what the university is about and allowing different answers to that question to emerge, for me would be a positive step, rather than, as I've already said, in the country where I am, getting locked into a value for money versus the freedom of the university discussion, which to me does not necessarily make the most creative platform for change. Back to you again now. Hi. Oh, the microphone, yes. Microphone.
Thanks. So first I have a question for you. So what would you say are the traditional values of the university? Mm-hmm. And then I have an additional point.
Yeah, I think the university has a responsibility as, well, I'm trying to find a way of putting this, if it's something to do with the pursuit of truth, putting it really naively. SDS scholars don't normally talk about the idea of truth in that way because we're very aware that it can be open to many different interpretations. But still the pursuit of knowledge, the pursuit of ways of thinking, and the possibility to do that irrespective of the social and political climate of the time, that's got to be what drives what makes a university different from many other knowledge-producing organizations. Yeah. Now I'm waiting for the follow-on.
Yeah. I have the opinion that it's a two-way street between society and universities, or citizenship and universities. So it's not only that the universities should engage in society more often or with citizens within the city or national, whatever, but also that the citizens are able to come to the universities and get to know the structure and get to know the knowledge that they try to teach at the universities. Because for me, university is very, they should teach you to think critically and to use that critical thinking then in your job or whatever. And it's not so about having the explicit knowledge that I need for my job later after university. It's more about really understanding how to think critically and how to develop specific skills, because I think that's more important than just giving knowledge to the students that they maybe don't really need or don't want. And then additional to the social sciences, for example, for me is philosophy just a way of creating critical thinking, or just talking about things that usually are not so much thought about. And if we teach that to students in university, I would say then they bring also that out to the society, and then the society also would more likely change because they also have then the more critical thinking.
But that's great, thank you. You said that way better than I did. That's absolutely right. I think, if there's a value of the university, it's got to be about being able to stand out and ask the critical questions, or to, the politically unpopular questions, the things which would sort of say push against the mainstream. So and that's why I put it like this, because, then positioning the university in a way which deals with people who are outside the university as well as inside needs some careful thinking. So that's part of it. But the other part of it is to say, so what then is the role of the university, given that fact, or given that reality, what then is the role of the university when it comes, for example, to issues like scientific citizenship? How do you play a role in that situation, given the points that were made before about the scale and the level of investment that goes in? But thank you for that. Yeah. You got a point. Yes, please.
Yeah, I don't think I really have a question as such, but more just how I'm thinking, and maybe it's slightly a different way of looking at some of the ways you framed the problem, or just a different way of phrasing it. But I was thinking about how, so the original kind of missions of the university was first of all sort of teaching and then research, and now, at least in the Netherlands, the whole sort of relevance and impact thing really gets sold as the third mission, right, in this kind of idea. And I was thinking a lot about what you were saying about this list that you had of different ways of being as universities, and everyone trying, or the newer universities trying to aspire to be like the classic model. But I was thinking it's almost like, for the classic models, they're the classic model, right? So they don't have to, they're done, they're okay, like they don't need to, but then for all everyone that comes later, it's like classic model plus, almost. You have to kind of add on more and more and more to try and compete with the classic model. And I think, like you're saying with this list, is actually it's aces in places, right? And that it's okay for people to be specialized in different things. Not everyone has to be able to do everything, because then that filters down to us as the staff, that then we're expected to do everything. We're expected to be able to teach, to do research, to be leaders, to be entrepreneurs, to be on TV, to be, and not everyone is good at doing it. Some person might just be very good at being a teacher, and that should be okay. That should be, but in the Netherlands, for example, it's hard just to have a teaching career. Like, you can't really make a career just as a teacher, or it's very difficult to. And so I think it's interesting to think about, these, like you said, these ways of, it's okay for institutions to be a teaching institution or a more engaged institution, and that not everyone should try and do everything, kind of thing. But I was just thinking about this sort of classic model plus idea that everyone has to add on.
Everyone needs to be world-class research excellence, and then you've got to ask yourself, what is this excellence that you're describing in that way? And I know there's discussions, actually, particularly in the Netherlands, about different career routes. And it's something, actually, Peter could talk about. It's CBS, where we have been involved in discussing those things a lot. Actually, Peter took the lead on that. But it's always pushing against the idea that, there's the real model, which would be back to the top of the list, the Oxford-Cambridge model. That's what we all know, that's excellence, really. And then we're trying to find a way of pushing that through. But as you say quite correctly, being a university teacher is a very significant task. So it's about being able to accept different career tracks within the public value of that university, because that's a really important goal and target, without making it seem in any way like it's a secondary or a second-rate thing. And this is where it gets quite complicated, because one university can do that and say, we're going to value as a university teacher, but another university is much more likely to keep to the traditional sort of classical values. So globalization and the movement of people around universities, which has many big advantages, can struggle a little bit with the fact that if you want to have a global research career, we know what that's about. So I think this is also a call to recognize some of those challenges and to say, well, how can different universities acknowledge those differences and find a way of working with them which doesn't just make the education-based development, for example, seen as a secondary kind of route. Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. Any more comments? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I have a question about the massification of the university, in the sense that I can't really make up my mind on whether I prefer the German model, where in a sense you also at the PhD level you try to give to many people the opportunity to do a PhD and to become a critical thinker, for instance, not necessarily with the idea that these people all have a university career, or whether I prefer the Dutch model, where we invest in people. We have a limited number of grants, so if you give money to somebody for doing a PhD, you have also quite a likelihood that you can continue in academia, because all the investment is put into one person. And I think the same comes down to lower levels of education, where I often wonder, I teach many students, where I wonder, are you really right here? Because I don't really see that you're really interested in what I try to teach you, but university is for us the way to go. I mean, if you have the chances, you go, rather than thinking about whether this is really the place where you flourish most. So, and at the same time, I think we should try to give this education to as many people as possible. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on this point, because I'm very confused.
Yeah, and you're right to be confused. I'm someone, when I went to university, I don't know, 5% of the British population, possibly even less, went to university. So in the early parts of my career, I was very, very much arguing for increasing entry, particularly from non-traditional groups. I guess I still think that that's the case. But of course, when that 5% goes to 40% or 45%, then you have to say, but what is the public value of the university from the student's point of view? And of course, many students will have views about this, but we see people who are there because it's a passport to something else. It's not really about being at the university at all, and then you get a kind of clash in terms of values. I suppose for me, I'm very, I still think the university's doors should be open rather than closed, but it's also, the idea that the only way for a young person of developing any kind of career or any sort of successful future is by getting this certificate. That's got to be challenged. I mean, it's got to be. I mean, is it the best way of using those people's lives? And so the social pressure to put intelligent people, and yes, the university should be opened, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the best investment. I know I'm saying that against myself. My institution has done very well on the growth of business school students, but even I have to say, as someone who benefits from this, are we delivering actually what's the best thing from those people's point of view? And should we, for example, have more flexible ways of dealing with this, with a particular emphasis on people coming perhaps later in life to university rather than coming at the age of 19? So the Massification Model and the idea that anyone who's capable of going to university ought to go to university has got to be open to question for me. It can't simply be one route. Yes?
Do you have a question?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, please.
Of course.
That inspired me to think, well, not to think well, also think, I guess, but we have discussions out there now that what the labor market needs in the future are skills and competences, and not degrees. And so some people think that the whole model of university is under pressure from employers who will basically test if young people have the right skills and competences, and they will not care about where those competences are created, whether you've done that online, whether you've gone to Google Academy or whatever it could be. And so do you think that the whole model of having sort of a brick and mortar kind of university is under threat?
It's actually remarkable, you know, how resilient the model of the university is. I guess that's part of it. I mean, you have to admire that in all kind of ways, that, you know, because despite the massive open online courses, yes, I'm saying that right, you know, which 8 years ago everyone was predicting we're just going to sweep away the institution because you just do it online, why would you need to do it? I mean, the institution is remarkably resilient. So that makes me very nervous about predicting that 20 years' time the universities will find themselves under great threat. I do think what I was just saying before, that the model must be that governments which are investing, states, publics in the end, investing so much money in universities, will ask, is this the best mode of investment? Is this the standard form that we should deliver? And I can't believe that the expansion, particularly in Western countries, of university investment is going to continue. There must be some kind of counterbalance, but I don't expect the institutions to be pushed away. You know, in the UK for a long, long time, people have talked about the collapse of a university and forced mergers, etc. I think I'm right in saying that that actually simply hasn't happened, despite it being threatened many times that institutions were going to disappear altogether. So it may be a kind of scaling down, and it may be that that creates some sort of rethinking, but it's going to be slow in coming.
But just to play the devil's advocate here, right? So maybe what's the reason why we don't see the crumbling of universities is that our students are so social and they like to meet other young people. They don't want to sit behind a screen to learn all this. They want to go out there and meet other people. But if they could do that also in a non-university setting and still get the competences that employers need, and then maybe at least we would see that the need to have researchers, scholars sitting in those buildings as well would not be so immediate.
Yeah, and there is something about, certainly where I work, I see this, students clearly signing up to a particular course because of the brand. You know, at Copenhagen Business School, the course on international business is the most competitive entry of all courses in Denmark. And now I've got to be careful what I say next because I've just remembered it's being videoed. But it's, you know, it's certainly a question as to whether those students are driven by a passion to study international business, or whether for many of them, yeah, it's a way of getting a means to an end. And that's got to be questioned. I mean, I think it seems to me that those, whilst in a way you're undercutting your own business, I think people inside the universities have to be able to raise themselves the issue. And perhaps we're the ones who have to take responsibility for that. To say, and this isn't about any particular course, that, you know, we have concerns about the way in which the university model has developed, and we could see, because we're closer to it, we could see alternative ways in which that could be met. So that would be the positive scenario. The negative scenario, and Ron Barnett, when he talks about this, often sounds a little depressed, frankly. He's an expert, world expert on higher education, but he feels there's a sort of downward spiral, quite frankly. I can't have that pessimism myself, but he would say, you know, this is just not a sustainable way of operating, and those pressures I talked about on careers, on students, you know, for him it's hard to see how that's going to go away. I would prefer to think that there are possible upbeat to it.
Well, you said something about the success of universities. They always get bigger, and you get more universities, and more people go to universities. But universities at least in Holland, I guess it's in Copenhagen the same, have a very easy models to make money. Yes, so it's just if you have more students, you get more money. So you can add some professors. You can make another vakgroep, what do we call it? Department. Yes, so it's a very easy way of doing it. So and they just don't say no. They always say yes. They say always if you can get money, you say yes. It's a very clear thing, and. Well, if I extend this to internationalization, and you said in Britain it's a very international business to get students. Well, Maastricht University in Holland was very early with getting international students, and they were successful by it because they get paid by the Dutch taxpayer. But nowadays, much universities get this model. Yes, so much universities know if I'm going to teach in Dutch, I can get foreign students of Dutch English. Yeah. Yes, yeah. I can get foreign students, and you have this problem with shopping malls. Yes, every little city thinks. I can have a very big shopping mall, and they just think about that the other little villages just have no shopping mall, big shopping mall, but every little city has this plan of making big shopping malls. So universities all gonna get prepared to get the international student, but then the success for each university will not be that big anymore, I guess.
And that's back to this point about, just one model, because if you are, just simply trying to compete with the next shopping mall, which is trying to do the next thing, it's not even a smart strategy, actually. You have to think about ways of doing it differently. I'm going to move on to the third and final stage, which is seeking new paths. And this is me looking around for some inspirations from different places. I always like this quote from Machado, there's no path, the path is made by walking. So I think it's also about not following well-established pathways, it's about finding ways of moving forward in imaginative ways. So, when this is the book I was talking about with the social engineers, it's in Danish, unfortunately, we talked about those kind of things, about valuing diversity, I've said that a few times, but also about building some kind of imaginative discussion about the future of the university, so I'm not going to say more about that. This is an interesting example. I talked before about public value. You can see a place, this is Cardiff Business School. It just happens to be, but I took a lot of inspiration from that, a business school, which comes in for very often criticism from the outside world about, well, our business schools doing enough for society. But Cardiff has tried to take this idea of public value. This is actually one of the drivers to speaking about this now, and saying, well, there are ways in which you can rethink what it is that the university is trying to do, and as they're putting it here, it's their PowerPoint, not mine, of making something quite interesting and quite successful out of this. So they say here, public value equals economic value plus social value. It's one way of trying to think again about what the purpose of training people in business is. You can see here that they put a kind of success ladder, I suppose, or a set of steps, and they have members of society with a moral sentiment and capacity to improve organizations and managers right at the top. Or you could see our public value strategy guides our activities and underpins our management decisions and commitments. We are a successful business school that delivers economic and social value through interdisciplinary research that addresses the grand challenges of our time. I'm not saying it's the perfect example, but I find it quite interesting that in the business school world you have a movement to say, well, yeah, we think we can do something different. It's about innovative, challenge-led research. It's certainly about students, but notice the emphasis about business and society, about the university, about funders, well-rounded graduates. So there's an effort there to say, we could think about the public value of what we're doing. In Cardiff Business School, that might mean, for example, working with homeless people. Not just reaching out to the traditional folks who would come to university, but engaging in a way which is perfectly in keeping with the values of the business school, is actually interesting for many students because they have contact with groups that they might not normally, but at the same time doesn't get in the way of research excellence. Right now there's a task force of the Chartered Association of Business Schools which is developing in the UK, which is developing just that kind of idea. It's called Business Schools and the Public Good. I'm a minor part of that, but it's again saying, well, what is the role, I'm just using the business school as an example here, what is the role of business school in wider society? It's a place where, as I said, there's been some criticism and some suggestion, perhaps not European business schools, possibly North American business schools have not been training people in public value, but at least to stop and think through, well, where then are we in that kind of discussion? You also have interesting ideas around innovation, and some of you will be familiar with this, particularly ideas of responsible research in innovation, which again are reflecting upon, this time, the relationship between innovation and the public good. Similar criticisms about innovation that you find to the ones I was hinting at before about the business school, of innovation being purely an economically driven agenda. So in this area you have people, this is Richard Owen and Maria Pansera just recently, saying, well, perhaps when we think about innovation, they don't use expressions of public good in there, no they don't, but we perhaps could think about what we're doing in terms of innovation in a rather different way. So proponents of RI striving for innovation that is more anticipatory, more reflexive, more inclusive, deliberative, open, and in total more responsive. Certainly you have discussions across Europe about RRI or RI, Responsible Research and Innovation, or just responsible innovation, which says we could think differently about what is driving the innovation process, and particularly what that means in a wider context. So of course I'm putting it in here because it suggests a similar way of thinking. Neither the Cardiff version there or back there, nor the idea of responsible research and innovation give you an easy answer, of course, but it's a challenge about how the innovation process works, or about how we teach, which at least leads to some positive rather than defensive answers. It's a way of thinking which I find enticing. And then there's the whole business of citizen science, which is a subject dear to my heart. So you have this, if you're not familiar with citizen science, you've got the idea that in all over the world, basically, you get some feeling from that. Of course, I put the Danish one right in the middle there, the citizen science network, that you have citizens who in some way are looking to connect with citizen science, or some way of working which actually is often outside the traditional institutions rather than inside of them. Kimura and Kinsey, I'm not going to go through all of that, talk about some of the potential virtues of citizen science. You can think of that as virtues, you might think some of them are more attractive than others, but you get the point that it's about the increasing amount of scientific data, it's about scientific literacy, but it's also about social capital, about inequality, challenging authority in a productive way, changing policy change, driving policy change, etc. So here's a movement which is, universities are involved in citizen science initiatives, but you could say the impetus, the energy is closer to something like scientific citizenship, as I said it before. And it seems to me that those kind of movements, whether it's responsible research and innovation or discussions about public value or citizen science, make us ask questions. And I'm going to finish this bit, and probably soon we'll wrap it all together, by raising just 3 points about universities, because so far I've been rather general, just to be extremely specific about it. I call the first one repairing our own houses, because it's about sort of say what we do to ourselves. The second one is about quality, and the third one is about, you see, you're a mind reader, about responsible leadership. Repairing our own houses. That's a joke, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, thanks. I know it's late in the evening. It seems to me if you think of ideas like citizen science, just take the general idea of knowledge being produced outside. It's quite an interesting question to say, how are our career structures, our academic career structures, enabling or disabling those kind of developments? That's something which people in the universities, to me, ought to be thinking about. It's not that citizen science is the only way forward, but certainly you could say, potentially at least, the way in which our career structures are put could actually be serving is to work against that sort of movement. Universities usually think of citizen science as a positive thing, but you could say that the way in which we're organizing our system, it's not just that it doesn't encourage it, it actually works as some kind of barrier. So how do we, not necessarily incentivize, but how do we recognize, which is also a point that came up earlier, those sorts of contributions to society? And I call it that repairing our own houses, because I think it's something that those of us who work in the universities need to ask, what kind of academic competences, what kind of training should we be providing to students, but also to staff, in order to grasp that kind of world? Again, just saying, the university has a value to provide independent knowledge is one element of it, but at a time when many people are saying, well, where are you, in fact, when it comes to environmental issues or climate change, to be specific, simply to say, well, the structures we have in place are so perfect, we don't even need to reconsider them, for me is deeply problematic. So there's one example of the challenge, to be really specific. How are our career structures working? How are our reward structures working? And how might we think differently about them if we take issues like citizen science seriously? What kind of excellence, not the excellence that's there in the picture, are we actually talking about? A second thing, which I'll just put up there, is about quality. When we talk about the quality or the excellence of what we're doing in the university sector, you have to say, well, quality in terms of what? What are the key characteristics we're looking for in quality? Relevance is one thing, but what about justice? What about participation? What about change? So you can see how quality could take a number of different dimensions. And then I wanted to finally talk about this thing of responsible leadership. That's a famous quotation from Peter Drucker. Most organizations, the bottleneck is at the top of the bottle. That's how we often think of the problem of university leadership. But actually, I don't agree. I think if universities are to address some of the things I've talked about, it's not only at the top of the bottle that things need to change. We were talking earlier today about citizen engagement and saying, don't think of the university as somewhere over there. We are also part of the university. So it's a task for the university as a whole. It needs a lot of communication. I think it means treating these arguments and discussions about what is the nature of public value as an asset. I think it's a strength of the university that it can deal with these things and not as some kind of distraction. And Cohen and March have this expression, sensible foolishness. I think that's the spirit of experimentation that I have in mind. The idea that it's fine to try things a little differently. And then we need a system nationally which holds universities accountable, but which also encourages innovation. I think when I look at the Danish system, my worry is precisely that the forms in which universities are held accountable is not encouraging innovation. Yes, it's about critique, but it's also about recognizing external challenges, structural problems and ambiguities, but also being able to experiment, to inspire, and to take the idea that we need to get to work on these things. So it seems to me that repairing our own house, thinking about quality, and thinking about the potential for universities to play a leadership role, none of those things are answers in themselves, but it might create a more positive environment for change. So basically that's it. Those are the three things I wanted to say, that there are challenges out there, but I think also major opportunities in the knowledge society where scientific citizenship is being expressed. It's got to be a huge potential and is something which universities are responding to, but they could go further. I think we need to ask questions about the role of the university and not simply fall back on the answers that were provided 100 years ago. Those answers work in certain circumstances, but they don't work in all circumstances. So I'm quite a radical, as you could hear, about asking new questions. And I think it's possible to imagine that there are several paths which can be followed by universities and not just one path. So a bold and brave and responsible leadership in the university would, for me, would be about saying, where are we? What's the context in which we're working? What particular challenges can we respond to and build upon? And then how can we have sensible foolishness and experimentation when dealing with those characteristics? So that is the end of all my PowerPoints. Any questions? I am conscious of time, but we still have 5 minutes or so, I do believe. Any questions or any points that anyone wants to raise? Hi.
Oh. Shout loud.
Yeah. Oh, this is wonderful. No, but it's nice. I like it. Yeah, this, thank you very much. That was very impressive from the heavens. I think, I think what citizen science does, just to answer that, because there was actually a lot of what you say, is ask questions at the university. You know, currently I think many university leaders are rather happy with citizen science because they see it as an extension of what they do. You know, now we can bring in people and they will be remote data sources, putting it crudely, and that will enable our knowledge base to spread. So it's cost efficient and it's good. I don't want to be dismissive of that. But of course, if you think about that, and it actually goes back to a point that Peter Mulgo made, that the idea that people can also be sources of knowledge, which is valuable in the context of their own lives, which isn't necessarily approved in academic journals, etc., because many citizen science groups are not interested in that, some are, but not all of them, is potentially just a little bit threatening, actually, to the nature of the university. So, you know, right now it seems like one part of the picture around citizen science is being accepted, but not the idea that, oh, this could, I'm not saying it will, make a kind of knowledge transformation that other groups start to say, you know what, we can do this for ourselves now. We don't need your pieces of paper in order to do that. And that's why I say, you know, it's interesting to reflect about the public value of the university, because it provokes the question, what then do you do in that situation? How do you, for example, if you think citizen science is important, how do you bring that in so that it's seen as a useful thing for a member of staff to be doing rather than the kind of promotion or communication activity? And how do we as a university choose to work with citizen science groups, do we so to say, bring them into the university and say that's also a valuable kind of knowledge development, or do we find some other way of collaborating? So on the one hand, you've got this incredible persistence of the university, but at the same time, you've got groups who are asking implicitly, not necessarily in an aggressive or a confrontational way, questions which are actually quite profound about, you know, what then are you doing in the university and how does it relate to our kind of activities? So I see citizen science is, yeah, it's not necessarily, I don't think it's something for researchers to be terrified of or nervous, but if you think through the implications of it, it leads you to ask some actually rather basic questions about the role of knowledge production. But I didn't answer all the points you made. Okay, thank you.
Maybe we can take,
let's take
one last question and then wrap up.
And it will be a little bit more of a direct question this time, I think. But I wanted to ask, I know, so this was quite a, I guess, STS-y way, and there's a handful of STS people in the room, not everyone, but they're sort of diagnosing the problem and kind of, you know, setting it out very clearly so that we're all aware of kind of what we're talking about. But I wondered towards the end, you started to talk about RRI and these kind of things, and I now do sort of history of these types of ideas of RRI, which can be quite depressing sometimes because it's a fairly recent history, and it's also then realizing how long we've been saying this stuff for, and also with the public value and the role of the university, people like David Noble and so on. Again, these discussions aren't new. So I just wondered, as a final thing, maybe as a lot of people being fairly junior academics in the room, like what are concrete things we can, because sometimes just raising the conversation or having the conversation isn't enough. Like how do we actually achieve change, and what are small things young people can do? Like what are tips or ideas of how we can try and actually do something?
Yeah, but that's why, thank you for the question, but that's why I said earlier that you shouldn't make the mistake of thinking the university is something that's happening over there, you know, and because, I mean, take that thing, just a very specific example about career structures, etc. I mean, that's an incredibly sensitive area. Many early career researchers, every early career researcher these days struggles hard. That's a tough situation to be in. So I know it doesn't feel very powerful to be that. But at the same time, if one responds to those pressures by, you know, retreating, so to say, by going back into metrics and the narrower indices, because that's how you deal with uncertainty, then that's actually making the problem worse, not better. Well, but I think you may have more. I understand your point, of course, but I think well, I say this because what I noticed the first time I ever really became aware of Google Scholar citations was not from a senior person, it was actually from an early career person. The first time I became aware of how journal rankings were being used was by someone I was interviewing for a job, and she started to tell me that her research was excellent because it had been published. I was shocked. You know, so it actually feels like a top-down imposition, but you could also see a bottom-up kind of pressure. I think, you know, raising the conversation, talking about the narrowness of academic career structures, building coalitions and alliances, getting the conversation started is already quite a valuable thing. You know, this is how it works. This is how environmentalist movement or feminist movements develop. It's by people making coalitions and simply saying, you know, there's something here that we legitimately want to talk about. If we just individualize the problem and say, how am I going to deal with it, you don't get very far. If you can raise a discussion more broadly, I realize, of course, I'm really sensitive to this. I see it on all sides. That it feels like the system is, so to say, tying you down in many ways. But it's still, I think, by having a discussion, by opening it up, perhaps challenging the terms of the debate, you may find you've got more supporters than you might realize. I mean, to go back to business schools, and I know the time is running, business school deans are often, the group who are talking about that. I hear that, and I'm actually a little bit surprised myself. So there's an awareness of a problem. I know there is, but many people feel somewhat trapped and don't know how to change it. The only way I know how to do anything about it is by building a movement. I mean, by having groups of people who are saying this, including talking about some of the subtleties of this. The constraints are also a way of working. It's a way of establishing yourself and making a claim to your own status. So we tend to play both sides of these games. But so talking about the ambiguities of that, to me, are also very valuable. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Irwin, for this very interesting lecture and for exploring with us this place that we love so much, and where we work and where we study and where we learn. Thanks a lot. Thank you all for joining us and for coming. Please give Mr. Irwin
Thank you very much.
applause.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.